Kings of the Universe is a fantasy anthology podcast, and therefore may contain material not suitable for all audiences, so listener discretion is advised. He marched into Kazaloo and turned Kazaloo into a ruined heap, so there was not even a perch for a bird left. The journey to Aeoland was a long and arduous one. Feralan had taken a small token of his army, some 1,000 strong. It was important to give the people of Aeoland the impression that he was coming for a delegation about a peaceful transfer of power. No one expected the oncoming slaughter. Kalmira had been very clear on her declaration. There are to be no survivors. The thought of total extermination did not improve his mood. Thurum and Galen were not at all pleased with the fact that they were now the vassal rulers of Meron. Galen refused to speak with him until the day of his journey, and Thurum spent weeks leading up to his departure locked in a tavern, drunkenly complaining about how, "I'm not capable enough to rule anything. I can tell you what's going on, and I can smith a fine weapon, but ruling? By my grandfather's beard, I can't do that." Galen finally spoke to his father as he was preparing to leave. "Father, are you sure about this? I've studied, but I don't know if I'm ready." Feralan held up a hand which cut him off. "One is rarely ready for the burden of responsibility. Gods know I wasn't, but I have faith in you. You are my eldest son, and the burden of rule will fall to you when my time comes. Hear me. You can do this, Galen. Trust your instincts and use your best judgment. If you still have doubts, ask the gods for their guidance." That seemed to pacify any lingering doubts that Galen had. His son nodded slowly before backing away from the chariot. Feralan looked out at the crowd of onlookers and raised a hand as his driver snapped the reins. The team of 4 donkeys brayed and broke off into a trot. It was nearly a week ago, and the journey had not been a pleasant one since. On the 6th day, one of the chariot wheels broke free from the wooden strut. They had lost the day off the trip, replacing it. At the start of the 2nd week, a starving lion ran afoul of the travelers. Feralan finally took the creature down with a fatal arrow shot through its neck as it tried to drag off one of his spearmen. The man was a little scratched and shaken from the event, but was mostly unharmed. So much so that he joked that Feralan take up lion hunting as a sport, for only a king could slay the king of beasts. In the city of Aeoland, Simon Moonworm sat hunched over a glass vial. He swirled the clear liquid, watching as the vortex gathered speed and torrented around its confines. Methodically, he grabbed the dagger and pressed the tip against his finger. As his life blood began to flow freely, he moved the vial under his finger. His blood began to sizzle as it landed in the clear concoction. He muttered an incantation under his breath. Most of the spell contained understandable words like rise and blood, tooth, and claw. The remaining words were guttural speech, unheard of and confusing to the mouths of those that had not been chosen by their deity to assist them. Those others, those unimaginative, the common people and the elites, they all would have fled with panic when one of the gods spoke to them. But not Simon. Simon knew he was meant for something greater. He would not be stuck in his lot as just merely the son of a brewer. He would ascend to greater heights than one could think possible. If he had to sacrifice some blood, his or otherwise, he would do so gladly. He stopped his spell, watching as the churning liquid slowed and a green hue slowly enveloped the rest. A small pink dot sat undisturbed in the center, a small island of calm in the unforgiving storm that he had made. "My latest child," he said proudly as he set down the vial to examine it. "In due time, you will be another member of the great army, and you will make your father proud." He turned his head and looked down at the rows of various sized vials and grinned. "You all will." A quick rapping at the door broke Simon's admiration of his creations. "What?" he snapped. A hesitant voice came through the door. "Simon, there's a royal procession heading towards the city." A wave of panic washed over him. "Why are they here? We've given them our yearly tribute. They should leave us alone like they always have." He growled. "Open the gate, and I will meet them at the temple." Simon wrung his hands nervously. Surely they were coming just to collect their tribute early. He had been very careful about his plans. Sure, the occasional peasant would drunkenly stumble into the room, but he always saw to it that they would never tell anyone. Feralan stood in the middle of the temple complex, eyeing everyone that he had not brought with him with a suspicious gaze. Aoland had always been on the outskirts of his kingdom, always paid their tribute on time, and caused little fuss when they sent delegates to speak with him. The thought that they were, knowing or unknowingly, making those things perturbed him. His gaze finally fell on the statue of the city's patron god, the god of flooding, Rossis. The statue looked over any onlookers, a war club raised over his head as if ready to strike down an oncoming enemy. His face twisted into a battle cry, a long, singular scar running down the folds of his cheek. An odd counterpoint. He held a clay jug of water at his side, as if guarding the vial of sacred water. Feralan had heard stories about this fickle and violent god. Unlike the other gods of nature and water, such as Nolios and Chakula, who brought plentiful harvests and rainfall, Rossis brought devastating floods. He was the primary reason why the city had moved twice in the past century. When the city was first founded on the banks of the Misty River, legend says that Rossis was disturbed by the sound of construction and called a massive flood to devastate the city. The survivors of that flood rebuilt the city a few miles away from the shoreline, but that was not far enough for Rossis. Though his temper was held off for a few decades before the citizens had forgotten the lessons of the past, and he sent another flood to devastate them. The final locale of Aoland, where Feralan stood, suffered from the main onslaught of the god's temperament. As cruel and fickle as he was, Feralan could hardly believe that their primary god could condone the creation of such creatures. From what he had seen in his vision with Calmira, whatever those things were could only be described as abominations. No, this had to be something more sinister, and the realization made his blood turn cold. Simon Moonworm shifted towards the main chamber of the temple. He stood hunched over, a stack of tablets in his arms and a clay water jug at his hip. He wore the vestments befitting of a high priest, a blue robe that trailed behind him, the edges laced with white patterns which formed the crest of waves, a satchel of reed stylus and various jars of aromatic herbs and spices that his god found pleasant. The signature item, to the untrained eye, or those not from the same cult, seemed innocuous, surrounded by beads of lapis lazuli, set a large, rounded piece of polished obsidian. Hail to you, my king," Simon said with a deep bow, his voice calm, despite the unease raising in his thoughts. "What has brought you to our humble city? I believe we have already given you our yearly tribute. Are the crops not to your liking? I can assure you that we have sent the very best of our yields to the overseer of Calmira." He laid the tablets down at the foot of the statue of Rossis and started to wring his hands nervously. "Surely all is well between our cities.
We have done nothing to earn your ire. Perhaps we could. A raised hand from Feralan silenced him. I can assure you that we are only here to look into a rumor. Nothing more. A faint flash of relief washed over Simon's face. Of course. There's nothing we dislike in our city more than falsehoods. What seems to be the vile and untruthful rumor that has been circulating about my fair city? Word has reached my ears that there are a select number of people in your city that are conversing with a dark and dangerous being. The rumor suggests that someone in your very temple is using blood magic to make something. As you can well imagine, anyone working with something so vile that it endorses blood magic simply cannot stand and needs to be removed. The color drained from Simon's face. Well, I don't think I've seen anything of the sort under my watch. Though if I may speak plainly, some of the temple slaves are a bit suspicious. They are always coming and going, all hours of the day, and some of them don't return at all. If you ask my honest opinion, you should round them up and figure out what they are doing. You said that they were using blood magic? What a vile thing to use. The very thought of it makes my skin crawl. Feralan nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the obsidian in the middle of his necklace. He had seen something like that before, but after all the years of conquest, he couldn't place where exactly he had seen it. The longer he looked at it, he swore he saw something inside of it shimmer. I don't suppose that my men and I could stay with you for a few weeks, just to make sure that these rumors are baseless. After all, no God-fearing people would openly practice such a barbaric custom. Simon suppressed a grimace, his hands unconsciously clenching into fists. He didn't feel the small stream of blood roll past his knuckle and fall to the floor. Of course not, my king. We would be happy to provide you and your men with lodging for as long as you deem it necessary. As Simon turned to show Feralan his lodgings, the fringes of his robe grazed the small puddle of blood beside him. This did not go unnoticed by Feralan, who eyed the growing trail suspiciously, as the rest of his retinue moved outside of the temple to fill the local inns. Feralan placed a hand on one of his soldiers' shoulders. Talvin, he said just above a whisper. Look at the floor. Do you see that blood? Talvin, by now a hardened man of years of conquest, nodded. I don't think Simon is as ignorant as he lets on. I think he might be actively practicing blood magic. See what you can learn, and report back to me in a few days. Talvin nodded briskly. It will be done, my king. Feralan couldn't help but feel a swelling of pride as he watched Talvin. It was hard to imagine that just a few years ago, he was a frightened young man who looked like he'd wet himself if he ever saw combat. I'm proud to call you one of my comrades, Talvin. Stay safe. Weeks passed in Aeland, and the citizens seemed tight-lipped when questioned about the possibility of anyone in their midst using blood magic. Any potential lead that Talvin had, the person who had the information was found with her throat cut. It was always the same. The victim would be left out in public, throat slashed, and a rounded piece of obsidian stuffed in the wound. He sat in one of the taverns with his companions, sharing a jug of beer. Their search had proved as useless as his. There were talks of cutting ranks and returning back home, but Talvin quashed any notion of that. We are here at the service of our king. We will not abandon him. Anyone who does so will be hunted down and killed like an animal. Do you would-be deserters have no honor? The icy look he gave them stifled the talks of desertion for a time. His mood improved somewhat when a young man approached him nervously and told him that he should be looking at the temple. When he tried to press the boy for more information, he must have spooked him, and he was gone the next day. No trace of him was left in the city. The boy, anyone who might have been related to him, just vanished. Tolvin watched as his comrades drank and laughed and joked until he couldn't stand it any longer. He stood up, nearly knocking his chair over. The temple, he thought, catching his chair. Everything happens at the temple. It all made sense. The wound in Simon's hand, the nervousness, the missing people. Who else could orchestrate the collective silence of a whole city? Someone who held enough sway and fear of the gods that he could easily cow all of the God-fearing citizens. Simon, he said aloud, not realizing that he was still in the tavern. Several patrons, including some of his comrades, gave him a wary look. He left in a hurry after that. He found his way back to the temple complex. An aura of stillness surrounded the grounds as he moved through the hallways. The torches did not burn. No mutterings of prayer came from the main chamber. There was nothing but silence. Something's wrong, Tolvin thought as he moved down to the lower chambers of the complex. Even this late at night, there should be someone here. A priest or a priestess should at least be tending the fires for late-night travelers. There was more to this than Feralan could have ever thought. These people weren't just practicing blood magic. They had turned their backs on their gods altogether. Tolvin finally made his way to the most basement of the temple. He approached a light dimly shining under the door. Whoever is behind there must be the one causing everything. He placed his hand gently on the door, uttering a small prayer that the door wouldn't creak as he opened it. Thankfully, the gods answered his prayers, and the door was silent. The muttering he heard as he drew closer made his blood run cold, and he couldn't understand most of the guttural chanting, but he was able to pick up the words blood, tooth, and claw. He drew his knife slowly, ready to strike against whoever was chanting those forbidden words. As he walked by the glass vials, the green liquid seemed to call to him.
Join us, Dolphin. You can be part of something greater.
The voice in his head was sickly sweet, like eating honey laced with ricin. I can't, he thought reluctantly, ripping himself away from the vials. I already am a part of something greater. I am a part of the greatest kingdom this world has ever seen. As he moved further along the hallway, he felt a haze wash over him. Why was he down here again? Why did he have his dagger in his hand? He looked up to see someone standing a few feet away. Greetings, stranger. Could you help me? I seem to have lost my way. He thought he saw the figure move closer to him. Surely, it was going to help him find his way back to wherever he was going. He never felt his dagger leave his hand, or the bite of the dagger against his throat. Simon stood over the crumpled body of Tolvin, gripping the dagger tightly in his hand. So one of his lackeys finally figured it out, he said, kneeling as he held a fistful of Tolvin's hair and pulled his head back. Such a pity for you, that you will not live long enough to see my master take over the world. Unfortunately, your part in this has come to an end. He grinned with delight as he watched the last light of life fade from Tolvin. The same eerie silence lingered the next morning as Feralan stepped out to the city square. Hushed murmurs came from the citizens, yet none seemed surprised at the sight. Feralan pushed through the crowd, curious to see what could have drawn such a large group of people. He froze, tears welling in his eyes as the sight came into full view. Tolvin sat crucified in the center of town. his throat slashed. Dried blood coated his chest. A tablet lay against the base of the crucifix. Death to those who stand against our God. Feralan's knuckles turned white with anger. He turned on his heels and marched towards the tavern that housed his men. The look he gave them told them everything they needed to know. Gather your weapons. We will make this city burn. The beginning of the attack happened quickly. 2 groups of 10 men moved towards the city gates. The small contingent of guards fell quickly to the professionalism and discipline of his troops. The gates closed nearly simultaneously. Those who were not in the city center started to panic, but the volley of arrows raining down quickly stopped their screams. In the center of the city, the rest of his troops marched out in their full combat gear and fell onto the crowd of onlookers. The ensuing melee was nothing short of a bloodbath. Scores of people, men, women, and children, fell in quick succession. Those that tried to find some safety in their homes had those same homes torn down and buried in the rubble. Feralan moved towards the temple. His war club dripped with the blood and brain matter of a farmer who charged at him with a pitchfork. 5 of his troops fell beside him, their spears dripping with blood. He glanced at the side and pointed to the ramp leading under the temple. The march down the corridor was brief. Feralan motioned towards the door. A soldier rammed the door. It swung open and cracked one of the vials positioned behind it. Simon cursed, watching a home for one of his children collapse to the ground. How dare you! You fools have no idea what kind of game you're playing, he screeched, his face turning bright red. My master needs these beautiful creatures. With these creatures, my children, the world will remember the name Simon Moonworm, and will praise the name Zulma. With a snarl, he grabbed the dagger off the table and launched himself at Feralan. Wild-eyed and frothing at the mouth, each slash was erratic and unpredictable. Feralan raised his war club to either block or parry the attack, but his reflexes were too slow to compare with the madman. One of his soldiers rushed Simon, waiting for the right moment, and lunged. Metal pierced flesh, ripping through tendons and veins, until stopping after slamming into Simon's kneecap. The pain sent him reeling. Fountains of blood gushed from the wound as he desperately swung before falling to the ground. The same soldier stood on his hand until another was able to kick the weapon away. Feralan looked down at the wild man that was once Simon. His eyes were still crazed, but he looked at each of his men like a rabid animal. Bring him to the center of the city, Feralan finally said, his voice a tempest of fury waiting to be unleashed. Prepare a crucifix and a burn pile. Animals this mad must be put down. My king, what about all of these things? A soldier asked, gesturing to the vials and the contents inside. Burn them. That order broke Simon, who began pleading and begging for mercy. Not for him, but for his children. He had given himself to Zulma years ago. Feralan stepped back into the sunlight. The sight of his men finishing off any would-be survivors helped calm the anger in his heart. Gather any wealth that this city may have and take it with you. This city burns. Once we have every piece of gold and scrap of food left. The city walls that once stood in open defiance against his rule finally fell, exposing the heart of the corpse to the wild animals and Charon beasts. A handful of his men had cut Talvin free and placed his body onto the cart. You will receive a proper burial when we return home. Feralan promised, noticing that the crucifix was still in relatively good shape. "Take it down and nail Simon to it. We will offer his life to Talvin's shade." As the sun began to set, the city that was once Aeoland was no more. The high city walls were no more. The buildings, now nothing more than rubble on the ground. In what used to be the town center, a charred wooden pillar stood, a silent reminder of those who would openly serve Zulma and defy the will of a king. A charred corpse lay in a heap in front of the pillar. Nothing but ash remained for the man called Simon Moonworm. In one last act against him and his dark master, Feralan would leave one lone man to cut the bones down and scatter them to the winds. His shade would never find the respite of libations and core. He would wander the endless plain of nothingness until time stopped. Pangs of hunger and thirst would be his only companions. Not even his dark god would attempt to resurrect him. Kings of the Universe was written, performed, and edited by Matthew Jordan. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and leave a review. As always, if you have any questions about the show or my sources, please feel free to email the show directly at kingsoftheuniversepod@gmail.com. Until then, I'll see you next time.